Hi, this is Corey Franklin with Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're doing a special show that's in line with our Congressional Medal of Honor winners, and we're featuring one of the great American soldiers of the 20th century, George Bud Day. Bud Day died recently at the age of 88, and he was not only a Congressional Medal of Honor winner, he served our country in three wars: World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. He was shot down in Vietnam in August of 1967. He was captured by the North Vietnamese, held prisoner for 5.5 years. During that time, he became the only American ever to escape from North Vietnam, and unfortunately, he was recaptured. He was sent back to Hanoi, where he was tortured along with his compatriot John McCain. As you'll hear, Senator John McCain on the floor of the Senate called Bud Day the bravest man he ever knew. Here's the story of Bud Day, a Hawkeye out of Sioux City, Iowa, who went on to become the most decorated American of our generation.
My heroes as a young boy were Charles Lindbergh, of course, who flew across the Atlantic in the late 1920s, and I was just a very small child when that happened. And then as World War II came along, of course, we had Jimmy Doolittle, who was the only good news in 1942 with his very bold carrier attack on Japan. So all those people kind of registered with me as heroes, and that's probably how I got to become an aviator.
Sioux City, Iowa native George Bud Day began his military career in 1942, when at the age of 17 he enlisted in the Marines. He served 3 years in the South Pacific during World War II, then completed his education before returning to service, this time as an Air Force fighter pilot during the Korean War. But these experiences could scarcely prepare him for what awaited him more than a decade later on a top-secret mission in Vietnam.
My first really hard-charging combat experiences were really in Vietnam. The concept was developed to maybe take some jet fighters and go up and do this reconnaissance, target spotting, marking, calling the force in, and taking targets out using the jet as a forward air control. I got picked to go up and do that, and it was a top secret project, and it was a really hairy mission because you spent a lot of hours, a lot of time fairly low to the ground at high speed getting shot at. And so I lost 42% of my airplanes in the first 6 months we operated. And I was one of those, I might add. And I got shot down August 26th on my 67th mission. I broke up in the ejection, shot the controls out of the airplane, and it tried to do an outside loop like this, and I was about 4,000 feet, and it wasn't going to do any outside loop. And I punched this out. I broke my arm here, here, and here, damaged my knee, and my oxygen mask didn't separate right and hit me in the eye and damaged my eye. So I wound up on the ground, got my radio out, found that my arm was fractured, and got a call off and told them I was on the ground alive. And young Vietnamese popped through the brush and captured me.
Major Day was taken to a North Vietnamese camp where he was interrogated and tortured for several days. But he escaped into the jungle and managed to evade the enemy for 2 weeks, crossing the Ben Hai River into the demilitarized zone. Day was the only POW to ever escape from North Vietnam.
Came very close to making it to freedom. I was within about a mile of Marine Corps base at Con Thien when some little Vietnamese popped out of the brush and yelled at me, and had been without food for all that time, and I was in fairly tough shape. I just said to myself, I've come this far to surrender to these little bastards, and so I took off running. They shot me and recaptured me, took me back up to North Vietnam, tortured me pretty brutally. They hung me by the arms and wound up wiping out my arms and hands and crippled me pretty badly.
After being returned to the camp from which he had escaped, Day was moved to the infamous Hanoi Hilton.
The prison we were in was the old French prison in Hanoi. This prison itself was designed for pretty good cleanliness, but The Vietnamese defeated all of that by boarding up all of the windows. It had a pretty good-sized window in every cell. And they plugged that full of batting, so it went quite dark. And then it was just absolute filth. You just had rats running around, and you're on about 700 calories a day of food, so you're all emaciated and big sunken eyes, and your health was very precarious. So the living conditions were just really at the bottom. And then you're in, on each one of the beds in this thing is a set of iron stocks that they're on a folding thing like this, so you whip them down over your ankles. And so, depending on how mad at you, might spend being stocks for 2 or 3 days at a time without ever getting out of stocks. And they moved John McCain, who's now the senator from Arizona, moved John in with me, and he was all busted up just like I was. And we got to be very dear friends. I had some absolutely brutal torture sessions, and 2 or 3 times, frankly, I would have preferred to die as to continue that. I had one session where I took 300 strokes of a fan belt. I was in leg irons, and they were beating me with a fan belt and a couple of beaters. And I can remember counting till 300 stroke, and I just said, why am I wasting my time counting here? They're going to kill me.
Day continued to endure brutal interrogations and unimaginable conditions, but resolutely resisted his captors for more than 5 years. His conduct in the face of lethal enemy pressure was a life-saving inspiration to his fellow inmates.
The bombing came in December of 1972. What happened was that suddenly at 9 o'clock at night, literally hundreds of bombers dropping 120 bombs per airplane or over Hanoi, dropping bombs, and it was just, the earth was vibrating, the pieces of stuff were falling off the ceiling. But that wonderful sound of freedom, because we knew that was exactly what it was going to take to get us out of there. And I had a big, quite large building, and my people were just really ecstatic. Everybody knew we were free. So we started getting released in February of 1973. First group came out February 14th, and John and I came out in the third group on March 14th of 1973. You live with somebody for as long as we did, you build up kind of a relationship that is just indescribable. And there were 4 of us who got to be very, very tight before the release. Wonderful to be getting released, but there would be a certain sadness about the fact that you were all going to go your separate ways. We developed some friendships that are just indescribably strong. It's very difficult to describe that feeling. You know that I had seen enough combat to know that there were certainly a lot of acts of courage that probably far exceeded what you saw yourself doing. I never really saw myself as having performed so extraordinarily that I was going to be a candidate for a Medal of Honor. So I was very humbled, and I recognized that I was getting this medal on behalf of a lot of other things and people who, for some reason, had not been recognized. We've been so fortunate by the accident of birth to be Americans. And having had that good fortune, our primary duty is to make sure that this country survives and that we stay free. That's ought to be the primary objective of every American every day for the rest of their life.
Well, as you'll notice with all our Congressional Medal of Honor winners, the common thread is humility. Bud Day was a very humble, generous man. Shortly after Bud Day died, his compatriot in North Vietnam, Senator John McCain from Arizona, gave this moving tribute on the floor of the U.S. Senate.
Sunday brought the sad news that my dear friend Colonel George E. Bud Day passed away. He was 88 years old. To say he lived a full life would be quite an understatement. His was filled with so many extraordinary experiences, adventures, challenges, accomplishments, and with such love, compassion, and courage that it could have supplied enough experiences, excitement, and satisfaction for 10 lifetimes. Bud knew defeats and triumphs on a scale few will ever know. He lived in moments filled with every conceivable emotion. He knew terror and suffering. He knew joy and deliverance. He knew solidarity, self-respect, and dignity. Knowing him as well as I did, I'm certain he faced his end, satisfied he had made the most of his time on earth. He will have faced it with courage as he faced all adversity. He will have faced it with gratitude for the love and companionship of his beloved wife and best friend, Dory, his sons, Stevie and George, and his twin girls, Sandra and Sonia. He will have faced it with humility for having had the honor to serve his country with distinction in 3 wars: World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. I had the honor of being Bud's friend for almost 5 decades of his 88 years. We met in 1967 when the Vietnamese left me to die in the prison cell Bud shared with Major Norris Overley. But Bud and Norris wouldn't let me die. They bathed me, fed me, nursed me, encouraged me, and ordered me back to life. Norris did much of the work. But Bud did all he could, considering that he, too, had recently been near death. Shot, bombed, beaten savagely by his captors, and his arm broken in 3 places. He was a hard man to kill, and he expected the same from his subordinates. They saved my life. A big debt to repay, obviously. But more than that, Bud showed me how to save my self-respect and my honor. And that is a debt I can never repay. Bud was a fierce, and I mean really fierce, resistor. He could not be broken in spirit, no matter how broken he was in body. Those who knew Bud after the war could see how tough he was. But my God, to have known him in prison, confronting our enemies day in and day out, never, ever yielding, defying men who had the power of life and death over us, to witness him sing the national anthem in response to having a rifle pointed at his face, well, that was something to behold. Unforgettable. No one had more guts than Bud, or greater determination to do his duty and then some, to keep faith with his country and his comrades, whatever the cost. Bud was my commanding officer, but more, he was my inspiration, as he was for all the men who were privileged to serve under him. Nothing offers more compelling testimony to Bud's guts and determination and his patriotism than the account of his escape from captivity. In the entire war, he was the only American who managed to escape from North Vietnam. In 1967, then Major Bud Day commanded a squadron of F-100s that served as forward air controllers over North Vietnam and Laos. They were called the Misties, named for Bud's favorite song. Theirs was probably the most dangerous combat duty in the Air Force, and they suffered high casualties. On August 26, Bud Day was one of those casualties. Bud was shot down by a surface-to-air missile 20 miles inside North Vietnam. He hit the fuselage of his F-100 when he ejected, breaking his arm, damaging his eye, and injuring his back. Bud was immediately captured by North Vietnamese militia. He was interrogated by his captors in an underground prison camp. When he refused to answer their questions, they staged a mock execution. Then they hung him by his feet for hours and beat him. Believing he was too badly injured to escape, they tied him up loosely and left him guarded by 2 green teenage soldiers. They misjudged him. On his 5th day of captivity, he untied his ropes and escaped. Bud stayed on the run for about 2 weeks. He wasn't certain how long he was free. He lost track of time. He made it across the DMZ and into South Vietnam. A bomb, however, had fallen near him his second night on the run, striking him with shrapnel, concussing him and rupturing his eardrums. But limping, bleeding, starving, and in great pain, Bud kept heading south, across rivers, through dense jungles, over hills, crawling sometimes on his hands and knees, evading enemy patrols, and surviving on berries, frogs, and rainwater. On the last night of Bud's escape, he arrived within 2 kilometers of a forward Marine base. Sensibly judging it more dangerous to approach the guarded base at night than to wait until morning when the Marine guards could see he was an American, Bud slept one more night in the jungle. Early the next morning, he encountered a Viet Cong patrol. He was shot trying to hobble to the base, recaptured, and returned to the camp he had escaped, where he was tortured some more. A few days later, Bud's captors took him to the prison we called the Plantation, where I would meet him 2 months later. He was one of the most grievously injured pilots to arrive in Hanoi. Norris helped nurse him back to some semblance of health, although he would never fully recover from his wounds. Then Bud helped Norris nurse me. Whenever I felt my spirits and resistance flag, I looked to Bud for the courage to continue and for the example of how to serve my country in difficult circumstances. Bud was the bravest man I ever knew, and I've known more than a few. He was great company, too, and made it possible to actually have fun in prison once in a while. He received the Medal of Honor when he came home, the highest of his many decorations for valor. Despite his injuries, he managed to regain flying status and commanded a flight wing at Eglin Air Force Base. When Bud ultimately retired from the Air Force, he practiced law. After his service in World War II, but before he deployed to the Korean War, he had graduated from college and law school. He devoted his practice to defending the interests of his fellow veterans. Bud and I stayed close through all the years that have passed since our war. We talked often. We saw each other regularly. He campaigned with me in all my campaigns and advised me always. We argued sometimes, agreed more often, laughed a lot, and always enjoyed each other's company. I'm going to miss him terribly. Even though Bud had reached advanced years, for some reason I could never imagine Bud yielding to anything, even, I thought, to the laws of nature. Tough old bird that he was, I always thought he would outlive us all. But he's gone now, to a heaven I expect he imagined would look like an Iowa cornfield in early winter filled with pheasants. I will miss Bud every day for the rest of my life, but I will see him again. I know I will. I'll hunt the field with him, and I look forward to it.
Very moving remarks from one courageous man to another. Several years before Bud Day died, a fellow Midwesterner who knows a little bit about the greatest generation, Tom Brokaw, did a short piece on him and mentioned the tribute that his hometown of Sioux City, Iowa gave to Bud Day.
Bud Day's remarkable life has taken him a long way from Siouxland, where Iowa, South Dakota, and Nebraska meet. It is the place to which he always returns, landing at the airport that now bears his name. A statue of himself, always on duty.
I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer, Sid Tepps. In our culture today, we tend to forget the bravery, the valor, and how much we owe to people like Colonel Bud Day. Our daily lives are filled with news and information about people who are far less important, far less valorous than Bud Day. And yet, ironically, it's the sacrifices of him and people like him who make that possible. Bud Day was a common man born in Iowa who became a great man by doing what he felt he had to do. And in tribute, we're going to close tonight with a little bit of Aaron Copland's Fanfare for a Common Man and final words from Colonel Bud Day. Colonel Day, I speak for myself, my family, and my generation. Thank you for your service to our country. We cannot begin to repay what we owe you.
Beyond medals, beyond bravery, beyond inspiration, Bud Day has passed every test, and in the end, gives us one credo to remember. Simply put,
Continue to love your country.